New York, a city where fortunes are built before sunrise and destroyed before sunset. Every morning, while millions of people are still asleep, billions of dollars begin changing hands behind the glass walls of Manhattan's financial district. Companies merge, corporations collapse, entire industries change direction, and almost no one outside those boardrooms ever knows why. In New York, power isn't measured by popularity. It's measured by influence, by negotiations, by contracts, by the people capable of changing the future of an entire corporation with nothing more than a signature. Among hundreds of prestigious law firms, one name stands above every other: Empire Law. For more than 30 decades, the firm has represented the world's largest corporations, global investment funds, technology giants, and some of the wealthiest people on the planet. Its lawyers aren't hired to participate. They're hired to win. Every impossible case eventually arrives at the same place: Empire Law. At the center of that reputation stands one man, Alexander Vale. Managing partner, a lawyer whose name became synonymous with impossible victories. He never needed to intimidate anyone. His reputation did that for him. Alexander built his entire career on the one simple belief: every problem has a weakness, every contract has a hidden opportunity, and every opponent eventually makes a mistake. You simply have to find it before everyone else. Over the last 20 years, he negotiated billion-dollar mergers, prevented hostile corporate takeovers, and protected companies that stood only hours away from financial collapse. His victories reshaped industries. His strategies became case studies. His clients trusted him with fortunes that exceeded the economies of entire countries. Inside Empire Law, every partner respected his judgment. Outside the firm, every competitor feared sitting across the negotiation table from him. Because once Alexander accepted a case, he almost never lost. But even the greatest strategist eventually faces something completely different. At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, a private helicopter landed on the rooftop of Empire Law. Minutes later, the executive boardroom doors opened. The CEO of Helix Dynamics walked inside carrying a single black briefcase. No assistants, no security, only silence. He slowly placed the briefcase on the conference table. Inside was one document, one contract, worth $42 billion. The atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. Every partner understood what that number meant. One wrong decision, and thousands of employees would lose their jobs. Investors would lose billions. One of America's fastest-growing technology companies would disappear. The contract had already been reviewed by every major corporate law firm in the country. Each one reached exactly the same conclusion: impossible. Every loophole had already been closed. Every legal strategy had failed. Every conventional solution had been exhausted. Helix Dynamics had only 48 hours before losing control of technology worth decades of research. Silence filled the room. Every executive looked toward Alexander Vale, waiting, expecting another miracle. Alexander calmly opened the file. Page after page, he examined every clause, every signature, every amendment, without saying a single word. Several long minutes passed. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, Alexander closed the contract, walked toward the enormous window overlooking Manhattan. The city continued moving beneath him. Traffic never stopped. Markets continued opening. People followed their ordinary routines, completely unaware that the future of a $42 billion company was hanging on a single decision. Alexander took a slow breath, turned toward the boardroom, looked directly at every person sitting around the table, then broke the silence. No. The room froze. One partner immediately objected. Another suggested assembling a larger legal team. Others proposed bringing in international specialists. Alexander remained completely calm. Then he delivered the sentence that no one expected to hear. This case doesn't need another lawyer. It needs someone capable of seeing what every lawyer has failed to see. For the first time in his career, Alexander Vale admitted that the greatest legal minds in New York were not enough. There was only one person who might be able to solve the impossible. The only problem was that he had never worked inside a law firm, and he had never wanted to.
Across the city, while the most powerful law firm in New York prepared for the biggest case in its history, someone completely unknown was beginning another ordinary morning. His name was Ethan Cross. He wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't a famous attorney, and he didn't belong to any prestigious law firm. In fact, almost no one in the corporate world knew his name. His office wasn't located inside a luxury skyscraper overlooking Manhattan. It was a quiet workspace filled with books, financial reports, legal documents, acquisition records, and years of handwritten notes that only he could fully understand. Ethan never sold legal advice. He sold clarity. While others searched for answers inside contracts, he searched for patterns hidden between the lines. Every merger, every acquisition, every financial statement, and every signature told a story that most people never noticed. Where executives saw numbers, Ethan saw intentions. Where lawyers saw clauses, he saw strategies. Where everyone else found confusion, he found order. His reputation had never been built through publicity or headlines. It traveled quietly through private recommendations between CEOs, investors, and business owners who had already discovered something remarkable. Whenever a negotiation became impossible, whenever billions of dollars were about to disappear, whenever every expert admitted defeat, there was always one final name whispered behind closed doors: Ethan Cross. He wasn't hired because people agreed with him. He was hired because he consistently noticed what everyone else overlooked. He had an extraordinary ability to connect details that appeared completely unrelated. A forgotten signature, a minor accounting discrepancy, a clause buried hundreds of pages inside a contract. To everyone else, they were insignificant details. To Ethan, they revealed the entire truth. Hours passed as he quietly analyzed another confidential corporate file. The office remained completely silent except for the sound of turning pages and the occasional note written across his glass board. Every document became another piece of a puzzle that slowly assembled itself inside his mind. By the time others realized there was a problem, Ethan had usually found the solution long before anyone asked the right question. Yet, despite everything he could do, the people inside Empire Law had never heard his name. Alexander Vale had no idea that the one person capable of seeing beyond a $42 billion contract was sitting alone in a modest office across the city. At that exact moment, two completely different worlds were moving toward the same destination, and neither of them knew that within the next 48 hours, everything they believed about power, intelligence, and success would change forever. While New York chased prestige, Ethan Cross chased the truth. Every morning began the same way. Before the city reached full speed, he was already inside a quiet office surrounded by books, financial reports, legal documents, and glowing computer screens. It wasn't impressive, but it didn't need to be. Ethan never searched for recognition. He searched for patterns. Every merger, every lawsuit, every acquisition left behind invisible fingerprints. Most lawyers focused on contracts. Most executives focused on profits. Ethan focused on behavior. He believed every decision told a story, and every story eventually revealed the person behind it. For years, he had quietly built a reputation that almost no one could explain. Companies hired him without ever placing his name on official documents. Billion-dollar negotiations suddenly changed direction after a single confidential report crossed a CEO's desk. He never asked for credit, he never appeared in photographs. He simply solved problems that everyone else believed were impossible. While Ethan uncovered another hidden connection buried deep inside thousands of pages of corporate records, across Manhattan, another man was facing a different battle. Alexander Vale stood silently in his executive office, staring at the $42 billion contract resting on his desk. Every major law firm had already failed. Every obvious strategy had already been exhausted. For the first time in his career, experience alone wasn't enough. Then, without warning, a secure encrypted message appeared on his private tablet. There was no sender, no explanation, no attachment, just a single name: Ethan Cross. Alexander read it once, then again. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since the Helix Dynamics case had arrived, something changed. The uncertainty disappeared. A quiet confidence replaced it. Alexander slowly closed the tablet and looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the Manhattan skyline. A slight smile appeared on his face. He had finally found the one person who might see what nobody else could. The invitation was brief, just an address, a time, and a name. Most people would have seen nothing unusual about it. Ethan Cross saw a pattern before he even arrived. As he stood before the towering glass headquarters of Empire Law, he wasn't impressed by the architecture or the reputation that surrounded it. Buildings never interested him. People did. Every decision hidden behind those walls had left traces, and Ethan had spent his entire life learning how to read traces that everyone else ignored. He stepped inside the lobby without hesitation. Around him, executives rushed toward elevators. Assistants answered urgent calls. Security guards watched every entrance, and expensive suits filled the polished marble halls. To everyone else, it looked like another ordinary morning in Manhattan. To Ethan, it looked like a perfectly organized system with invisible weaknesses. His eyes moved quietly from one detail to another: the placement of security cameras, the timing of the elevators, the nervous expression of a receptionist, a confidential folder left open for just a second. Small details, tiny mistakes, the kind of mistakes that usually became billion-dollar disasters. Patterns always appeared before people noticed them, and Ethan had built his reputation by seeing what others couldn't. Several floors above, Alexander Vale stood inside the executive boardroom looking at the $42 billion contract that every major law firm had already rejected. For the first time in 20 years, he had reached the edge of his own certainty. Every clause had been analyzed, every loophole had been examined, every expert had reached the same conclusion. The deal was impossible. Yet Alexander refused to believe impossible was the final answer. He turned toward the boardroom doors as the elevator reached the executive floor. Ethan Cross walked through the silent hallway with the same calm expression he had worn since entering the building. He wasn't intimidated by the firm's reputation, its wealth, or the powerful names waiting inside. None of that mattered. Facts mattered. Logic mattered. Truth mattered. Behind the closed doors, the partners waited in complete silence. Some expected another consultant. Others expected another disappointment. None of them expected the man who was about to enter. The doors opened slowly. Ethan stepped into the room without saying a word. Every eye turned toward him. Alexander studied him carefully. There was no arrogance, no anxiety, no need to impress anyone. Only absolute composure. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was recognition. Two minds built in completely different worlds, reaching exactly the same conclusion. Alexander slowly stood from his chair and walked around the conference table. He stopped directly in front of Ethan. A faint smile appeared across his face. "Mr. Cross," he extended his hand. "I've been looking for someone like you." Ethan looked at the hand for a brief moment before returning Alexander's gaze. The real case was finally about to begin. Alexander looked directly into Ethan's eyes. For the first time that morning, the room felt completely silent. Every partner, every executive, every assistant stopped moving. Then, with absolute confidence, Alexander spoke. "I have an offer." The words echoed across the boardroom. "Join Empire Law." No one had expected those words. Empire Law didn't recruit strangers. It certainly didn't invite someone who had just challenged its most powerful attorney. All eyes turned toward Ethan. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, studying every face. He saw expensive suits, impressive titles, decades of experience, and something else. Fear. Not fear of losing the case, fear of changing the way they had always done things. After a long silence, Ethan finally spoke. "No." The room froze. Several partners looked at each other in disbelief. Some couldn't hide their frustration. Others simply couldn't understand how anyone could reject the opportunity of a lifetime. Alexander, however, didn't react the way they expected. A subtle smile appeared on his face. It wasn't disappointment, it was curiosity. He leaned forward slightly and asked only one question. "Why?" Ethan met his eyes without hesitation. "Because you're not looking for someone to solve this case." Another silence filled the room. "You're looking for someone to protect a system that has already failed." Every executive remained motionless. "You want another lawyer." Ethan slowly shook his head. "But this case doesn't need another lawyer. It needs someone willing to question every assumption that brought you here." For the first time in years, Alexander wasn't listening to an argument. He was listening to a perspective no one else had dared to offer. Something changed, not in the room, not in the contract, in Alexander himself. He looked at Ethan for several long seconds. Then, without saying another word, he opened his leather briefcase. From inside, he removed a thick, black confidential file. The room watched in complete silence as he placed it on the polished marble table and slowly slid it toward Ethan. The file stopped directly in front of him. Alexander never looked away. Then he spoke. "Tell me." He paused. "What everyone else missed." Ethan took one last look at the Manhattan skyline before making his decision. The city below never stopped moving, but inside the boardroom, time itself seemed to stand still. Every partner, every executive, every eye was fixed on him. waiting for the answer that could change the future of empire law. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I don't work for titles," he said calmly. "I work for the truth." The words echoed through the room with unexpected weight. No one interrupted, no one moved. For a brief moment, the silence became louder than any argument. Alexander Vale studied Ethan carefully. For the first time in years, a subtle smile appeared on his face. It wasn't amusement, it was recognition. He had spent 2 decades searching for brilliant lawyers, exceptional negotiators, and fearless strategists. Yet standing before him was someone entirely different. Someone who saw problems from a perspective no one else could. But admiration was far from unanimous. Across the table, Victoria Hart remained unconvinced. She had dedicated her entire career to discipline, preparation, and evidence. To her, instinct was dangerous, and confidence without proof was a liability that no elite law firm could afford. She slowly stood from her chair, her expression composed but unmistakably firm. This firm wasn't built on instinct, it was built on proof. The atmosphere inside the room shifted instantly. What had begun as a recruitment meeting was becoming something far more significant. It was no longer about a $42 billion contract. It was about 2 completely different philosophies colliding for the first time. Alexander remained silent, watching both of them without revealing whose side he was on. He knew that the outcome of this conversation would determine much more than the future of one case. It would determine the future of empire law itself. And for Ethan Cross, the real negotiation had only just begun. The room had fallen silent. Every partner around the table understood that the next decision could define the future of empire law. Alexander Vale stood at the head of the boardroom, calm and unreadable, while the skyline of Manhattan glowed behind him. Across the table, Ethan Cross remained silent, watching every face instead of every document. Victoria Hart broke the silence first. She argued that bringing an outsider into the firm's most important case could destroy everything they had spent decades building. Several partners quietly agreed, believing that trust was worth more than talent, but others saw the situation differently. Julian Rhodes reminded the room that refusing to change could be even more dangerous than taking a calculated risk. Every passing minute increased the pressure as the deadline moved closer. The atmosphere grew heavier with every argument. Voices became sharper. Confidence slowly turned into uncertainty. Yet through all the tension, Ethan never interrupted. He wasn't studying the contract. He wasn't following the debate. He was reading something far more valuable: the reactions, the hesitation, the fear hidden behind every confident statement. Alexander noticed it immediately. While everyone else focused on legal strategies, Ethan was watching people. Every movement, every pause, every glance across the room revealed something that no document ever could. For the first time since the meeting began, Alexander stopped thinking about the contract and started thinking about the young man sitting quietly across the table. The discussion continued, but Alexander barely heard another word. His attention had shifted completely. Perhaps the answer had never been hidden inside the billions of dollars, the legal clauses, or the impossible negotiations. Perhaps the answer had entered the room without anyone realizing it. And at that exact moment, as Alexander and Ethan locked eyes across the conference table, the future of empire law quietly began to change. The strategy was finally in motion. Inside Empire Law, every department moved with absolute precision, knowing that one wrong decision could destroy a $42 billion deal. Alexander Vale organized every legal argument, every negotiation path, and every possible outcome. But for the first time in his career, even he couldn't see a clear way forward. Across the conference room, confidence slowly began to disappear from the client's face. Hours passed without a breakthrough, and the silence inside the firm became heavier than any courtroom verdict. Every minute brought the deadline closer, increasing the pressure on everyone involved. While the partners debated impossible solutions, Ethan Cross remained almost invisible. He ignored the conversations, the tension, and the growing panic around him. Alone in the firm's legal archive, he continued reading page after page of the massive contract, searching for something everyone else had overlooked. Hundreds of clauses, thousands of words, every signature, every amendment, every footnote demanded his attention. The rest of the legal team searched for answers in strategy meetings, financial projections, and endless negotiations, believing the solution had to be hidden somewhere inside the obvious. Ethan believed the opposite. He knew that the biggest mistakes were rarely found in plain sight. They were buried inside details that everyone considered insignificant. Then, something made him stop. A single sentence, hidden deep inside an old contractual amendment, a forgotten clause. Ethan read it again, and then he smiled. Silence spread across the boardroom like a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. Every pair of eyes turned toward Alexander Vale, waiting for the confidence that had carried Empire Law through 2 decades of impossible victories. But before he could speak, the CEO of Helix Dynamics broke the silence. Time was running out, investors were demanding answers, and $42 billion were hanging by a thread. For the first time since entering the room, doubt replaced certainty. Around the table, the partners exchanged anxious glances, searching for an argument, a strategy, anything that could change the direction of the negotiation. But no one had an answer. The room that had once been filled with confidence was now consumed by uncertainty. Hidden away from the growing tension, Ethan Cross continued reading the contract alone. While everyone else focused on the obvious problems, he quietly examined every page, every sentence, and every forgotten detail. Then, something caught his attention. One paragraph refused to fit the pattern. It looked ordinary, almost invisible, yet the more he studied it, the more impossible it became to ignore. Ethan stopped turning the pages. He read the same clause again and again. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. For the first time since the crisis had begun, a faint smile appeared on his face. Everyone else believed the case was falling apart. Ethan had just realized they had been looking in the wrong place all along. Ethan ignored every distraction around him. While the rest of the firm searched for answers in meetings and arguments, he searched for them where the truth could never hide, in the documents. Every contract tells 2 stories, the one everyone reads and the one someone hopes will remain invisible forever. Page after page, line after line, Ethan refused to rush. He compared every version, every signature, every amendment, looking for something that didn't belong. Then suddenly, his eyes stopped. Buried inside an old appendix was a forgotten amendment, quietly attached years before and never mentioned again. It had never been challenged, never questioned, and never used. For everyone else, it was just another meaningless page. But to Ethan, it was the missing piece of the entire puzzle. In that single moment, everything changed. The impossible case was no longer impossible. Standing before the Manhattan skyline as the first light of dawn filled the room, Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile. For the first time since the case had begun, he knew exactly how to win. The meeting was over before anyone had the courage to admit it. The CEO of Helix Dynamics rose from the table, closed the folder in front of him, and turned toward the door. Behind him, his executives followed without saying a word. Helix had given Empire Law 48 hours. Now it was giving them 46 seconds. The CEO stopped at the door and looked back at Alexander Vale. He had come to the most respected law firm in New York because he had been promised that impossible problems could be solved. But every strategy had failed. Every legal path had closed. Every argument had collapsed. Alexander did not ask him to stay. He only said 2 words. 10 minutes. It was not a request, it was a promise. The doors closed and the boardroom fell silent. Victoria Hart had exhausted every legal option. There was no injunction left to file. Julian Rhodes had contacted every regulator who could possibly intervene. None of them would. The acquisition could not be stopped. The client had lost confidence. The opposing side knew it, and for the first time that night, Empire Law appeared to have no move left. But while everyone else was searching for a way to stop the acquisition, Ethan Cross was no longer looking at the acquisition at all. He was studying the people who had written the contract. He compared signatures, dates, definitions, old annexes, forgotten language buried beneath hundreds of pages. Then he found it. An agreement signed 11 years earlier, an annex no one considered important, a clause no one had questioned. It did not prevent Helix Dynamics from being acquired. It made the acquisition dangerous. Years before, Helix had accepted responsibility for protecting a classified technology portfolio. That obligation could not be divided, it could not be abandoned, and it could not be transferred by negotiation. But it could be inherited. The moment another corporation acquired Helix, it would also inherit every legal obligation attached to that portfolio. Every breach, every undisclosed failure, every risk that had not yet been discovered. The buyer believed it was purchasing a $42 billion company. What it was actually purchasing was an unlimited liability. Victoria understood the legal impact immediately. Julian understood what it would do to the negotiation, and Alexander understood something even more important. They did not need to stop the acquisition. They only needed to make the buyer afraid of completing it. For the first time that night, Alexander Vale smiled. Not because the case had been won, because the war had finally begun. He told Victoria to bring the client back. He told Julian to call the other side. Then he looked at Ethan. The client believed Empire Law had found a solution. But what Ethan Cross had actually found was leverage.
With less than 6 hours remaining before the deadline, both sides agreed to one final negotiation. It wasn't simply another meeting, it was the last opportunity to prevent one of the largest corporate collapses in modern history. The boardroom inside Empire Law had become a battlefield where every word carried the weight of billions of dollars. Around the table sat CEOs, attorneys, investors, and executives who had spent months preparing for this moment. Every expression was controlled, every silence was calculated. Alexander Vale entered the room without a single document in his hands. He didn't need one. His reputation had always spoken louder than any contract. Calm, composed, and completely unreadable, he walked toward the head of the table as every eye followed him. No one dared to interrupt the silence. On one side sat the leadership of Helix Dynamics, determined to protect the company at all costs. Across from them were the representatives of the rival corporation, accompanied by elite attorneys and financial strategists, convinced that victory was already theirs. Before the negotiations could begin, Victoria Hart quietly placed a confidential page in front of Alexander.
She had spent the entire night studying every clause, every signature, and every hidden condition. What appeared to be a generous proposal was in reality a carefully engineered trap designed to transfer control of Helix dynamics without anyone noticing until it was too late. Confident smiles appeared across the opposing side as their lead attorney pushed a single folder across the marble table. $12 billion. Enough money to make surrender look like success. Every executive around the table immediately focused on the offer. Everyone, except Ethan Cross. While the others stared at the numbers, Ethan watched the people behind them. Tiny details began to reveal themselves. One executive suddenly avoided eye contact. Another instinctively tightened the strap of his watch. A senior attorney exchanged a nervous glance with someone at the far end of the table. Small reactions impossible to notice unless you were looking for them. Alexander never opened the folder. Instead, he calmly placed 2 fingers on its cover and slowly pushed it back across the table. The room felt completely silent. Then he finally spoke. $12 billion isn't your offer. He paused, allowing the silence to become heavier than his words. It's the price you're willing to pay to keep something hidden. For the first time that evening, confidence disappeared from the faces of the opposing delegation. Without saying a word, Ethan reached into his portfolio and placed a single photograph at the center of the table. It showed an isolated research facility, a company that had never appeared in any official document, a company that, according to every public record, didn't even exist. The reaction was immediate. One executive froze, another looked away, a third instinctively reached for the folder they had desperately tried to protect. Alexander didn't need an explanation. He had just watched the truth reveal itself. In that single moment, everything changed. The negotiation was no longer about saving Helix dynamics. It had become an investigation. And for the first time that night, the people who believed they controlled the room realized they were the ones being exposed.
The room fell into complete silence. No one was willing to make the first move because everyone understood that a single sentence could decide the future of a $42 billion agreement. Alexander Vale calmly looked around the table, studying every face before finally speaking. It wasn't a speech or an argument. It was a single question. One simple question that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the room. The executives exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time since the negotiation had begun, confidence disappeared from their expressions. The CEO of Helix Dynamics, who had entered the room believing he controlled every variable, hesitated. His pen stopped moving. His eyes briefly left the contract, searching for an answer that wasn't written on any page. While everyone focused on the documents, Ethan Cross remained completely silent. He wasn't reading clauses or calculating numbers. He was watching people. Every hesitation, every glance, every controlled breath revealed information far more valuable than the contract itself. He understood that negotiations are never won by words alone. They are won by understanding the people behind them. Without saying a word, Alexander noticed exactly what Ethan had discovered. A brief exchange of eye contact was enough. Neither of them needed to explain anything. Years of experience met extraordinary perception in a single silent moment. The contract was no longer the battlefield. The real negotiation had moved somewhere else. It had become a contest of confidence, fear, pressure, and perception. Every person sitting around that table believed they were hiding something, but someone had already revealed far more than they realized. Alexander slowly raised his eyes towards one executive across the room. He didn't accuse him. He didn't interrupt the meeting. He simply looked at him in complete silence. In that instant, everyone understood that a mistake had just been made. The only question left was whether anyone else had noticed it. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Every conversation stopped the moment the doors opened.
Every eye turned toward Alexander Vale as he walked through the center aisle with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his entire career winning battles no one else believed could be won. Behind him came Ethan Cross, carrying nothing more than a slim confidential folder. Few people in the room recognized him, and those who did couldn't understand why he had been invited to stand beside the most respected attorney in New York. Across the courtroom, the opposing legal team exchanged confident smiles. They believed the verdict had already been decided. Months of preparation, thousands of pages of evidence, and the support of the largest corporate law firms in the country had convinced them that victory was inevitable. To them, empire law had simply delayed the inevitable. Carefully, the judge observed both sides before signaling that the hearing would begin. Alexander never looked toward his opponents. Instead, he calmly opened the confidential case file resting on the polished wooden table. His expression never changed. Years of experience had taught him that emotions were useless inside a courtroom. Facts were the only language that mattered. As the opening arguments echoed through the chamber, Ethan remained completely silent. While everyone focused on the attorney speaking before the judge, his attention drifted to something almost invisible. A single page, a single signature, a detail so small that hundreds of lawyers, consultants, auditors, and investigators had overlooked. He studied the document again, then once more. The dates matched, the clauses matched, the financial figures matched. Everything appeared perfect, except for one signature. It wasn't forged, it wasn't missing, it was simply impossible. A single stroke of ink revealed a contradiction that should never have existed inside a $42 billion agreement. In that instant, Ethan realized the entire case had been built upon a document that could no longer support itself. Without saying a single word, he slid the page toward Alexander. Alexander read the signature. His eyes paused for less than a second. Then, for the first time since the case had begun, he smiled. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Every argument had already been presented. Every piece of evidence had been examined. Every expert had spoken. The opposing counsel leaned back with quiet confidence, convinced the outcome was no longer in doubt. To everyone watching, the case appeared to be over. But Alexander Vale never accepted appearances as truth. He remained standing without moving, his expression calm. His eyes never drifted toward the jury. He wasn't interested in persuading 12 strangers. He knew the real decision had already begun somewhere else. While everyone focused on the law, Alexander focused on the people behind it. Across the courtroom, the CEO of Helix Dynamics tried to remain composed, but the confidence he carried into the room was beginning to disappear. Small details betrayed him. A brief hesitation, an uneasy breath, a subtle movement of his hands. Alexander noticed every one of them. Without raising his voice, he slowly walked toward the center of the courtroom. Each step echoed through the silent chamber. Every pair of eyes followed him. Even the judge remained perfectly still, waiting for what would come next. Alexander stopped. He looked directly at the CEO and asked only one question. Who truly benefits if this deal survives? The question hung in the air. No one answered. The silence became heavier than any argument that had been made throughout the entire trial. The attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. Members of the jury looked at one another, searching for an explanation that never came. The confidence that had filled the room moments before was gone. Then, For the first time since the trial had begun, Ethan Cross slowly stood from his seat. He said nothing. He carried only a single confidential document in his hand. Alexander turned toward him without surprise. He had been waiting for this moment all along. Ethan walked forward with complete confidence and placed the document before the judge. The courtroom froze. The judge lowered his eyes to the page. The opposing attorneys immediately understood that something was terribly wrong. The CEO of Helix Dynamics could no longer hide his fear on his face. Alexander remained perfectly calm. Then, Ethan broke the silence with 6 simple words. "This changes everything." The judge looked up. No one spoke. No one moved. And in that single moment, the entire case changed forever.
The courtroom fell completely silent. For the first time since the trial had begun, no one dared to speak. Every eye was fixed on the judge, waiting for a single sentence that would determine the future of a $42 billion empire. Alexander Vale stood perfectly still, his expression calm, his confidence unshaken. Beside him, Ethan Cross watched every movement inside the courtroom with the precision of someone searching for answers that no one else knew existed. Finally, the judge announced the verdict. Helix Dynamics had won. A quiet wave of relief spread across the room. Executives exchanged restrained smiles, attorneys shook hands, and years of uncertainty seemed to disappear in a single moment. The impossible case had finally been solved. Empire Law had done what every other major law firm had failed to accomplish. Alexander slowly closed the confidential file resting on the table. Another impossible victory had been added to his extraordinary career. But Ethan wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at the celebrating executives either. His eyes followed a single man quietly leaving the courtroom through a private side exit. Something didn't feel right. The stranger casually picked up a small black encrypted flash drive that had been left on the conference table only seconds earlier. No one noticed the exchange. No one except Ethan. In that instant, everything changed. Ethan's attention shifted back to the duplicate contract lying on the table. He opened it carefully, turning each page one by one until his expression suddenly froze. One page was missing. The page that contained the final ownership structure of the merger had disappeared. The courtroom victory suddenly meant nothing. The contract had never been the true objective. The lawsuit itself had only been a distraction. Someone had stolen the largest corporate trial in American history to steal information worth far more than $42 billion. Alexander noticed the change in Ethan's expression. Without speaking a single word, Ethan slowly raised his eyes and gave him the smallest possible warning. Alexander immediately understood. They had won the case, but they had failed to stop the real operation. As the courtroom emptied, both men walked toward the large windows overlooking Manhattan. Outside, a long black limousine silently pulled away from the courthouse. For a brief second, through the tinted glass, Ethan caught sight of a gloved hand holding the same black encrypted flash drive. The passenger's face remained hidden. The limousine disappeared into the streets of New York. Ethan finally broke the silence. "We didn't stop the conspiracy." He looked toward Alexander with absolute certainty. "We only won the first battle." For the first time that night, no one in the room knew what to say. The silence inside Empire Law was heavier than any accusation. Natalie had found something every other law firm had missed: a hidden annex, a document buried beneath layers of encrypted files, offshore companies, and false corporate identities. The contract did not transfer money, it transferred control. $42 billion were only the surface. The real objective was Helix Dynamics itself. Ethan followed the structure until every hidden connection led to the same name:
Asterion Holdings, a company that officially owned almost nothing but secretly controlled everything. Then Sophia Leone recognized it. Months earlier, she had authorized a confidential transfer to the same company. She had believed it was part of a legitimate restructuring. Now she understood the truth. Victoria understood it too. Empire Law had never been hired to save the agreement. They had been hired to legitimize it. The man asking them to protect Helix Dynamics was the same man trying to steal it. Alexander looked across the table at the CEO. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The evidence had already spoken for him. Julian closed the doors. No one would leave until the truth was complete. Then Natalie discovered the final mechanism. At midnight, the transfer would become irreversible. They had only 11 minutes to stop a $42 billion takeover. Alexander took control of the room. Victoria would prepare an emergency injunction. Julian would find an emergency contact he had. Natalie traced the transfer to a private server hidden beneath Manhattan, but the server could not be stopped without the original authorization. Ethan studied the protocol, a biometric signature, a recorded voice command, the approval of the person who designed the operation. Then Sophia reached into her bag. She placed a small recorder on the table. One piece of evidence no one knew existed. A private conversation with the CEO of Helix Dynamics. When Natalie played the recording, the voice inside the room belonged to the man sitting across from them. His own words revealed the plan, the offshore company, the hidden transfer, the takeover. The CEO's expression changed. For the first time, he looked afraid. The final seconds disappeared. Victoria completed the injunction. Julian secured the judge. Natalie prepared the emergency stop. Ethan confirmed the authorization chain. 3 seconds before midnight, the court accepted the filing. The transfer stopped. Helix Dynamics survived. Its architect did not. Federal agents entered the boardroom and escorted the CEO away. No one celebrated. They were too exhausted, too disturbed by how close the company had come to disappearing. The impossible case was over, but Ethan was still looking at the screen. Something remained hidden inside the original contract data. A name. His name. Cross. Alexander had already seen it. He walked toward the table and placed an old photograph in front of Ethan, a photograph of the original founders of Helix Dynamics, and standing beside them was a man Ethan knew immediately. His father. Alexander looked at him. "You were right, Ethan. Someone inside this case could see what no one else could." He paused. "Your father built it." The impossible case had been solved. But for Ethan Cross, the real case had just begun.
In a city made of glass, every shadow has a name. Every promise hides a past. Every victory feeds the flame. High above the streets below, where the silent fortunes grow.